Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Earning Curve Expert Panel Series. The Earning Curve is a new platform in webinars, and it's a little different from other webinars you may have attended in the past. So you as the audience drives all the panel questions. My name is Marian Biangardi, Head of Business Development at Commercial Trelor Company. Today we are talking about managing supply chain and the uncertainty around supply chain with COVID. So, point out real quick, you can send your chat questions. We want to get all your questions answered. So look for the thought bubble icon at the bottom of your screen. Type your questions in there and we will get them answered for you. So we have gathered the best experts in the field of supply chain and manufacturing in the St. Louis area. We're going to start with Mark Bowers. Mark Bowers is the CEO and the founder of St. Louis Makes. Mark has created St. Louis Makes. It's a manufacturing nonprofit, and this manufacturing nonprofit promotes the best practices in new products, product management, and business development. So a couple of interesting facts. Mark Bowers speaks fluent German, and he loves to travel. So when Mark, like a few years ago, Mark was traveling, he's actually traveled, this is an interesting thing, from Beijing, China to Cairo, Egypt without ever boarding an airplane. And when I asked how that was even possible, I think a lot of combination of cars, buses, trains, and I think he did some hitchhiking. So yes, avid traveler, Mark Bowers. Then Cindy Miebrewer, good German name. Cindy is the Director of Supply Chain Excellence at the Sept School of Business and at SLU. She spent the majority of her career in education. Cindy has had some interesting pets in the past. I think her sister was involved with animal rescue. So growing up, they had a pet hedgehog along with a flying squirrel. She calls it a sugar glider. At least half a dozen other cats and a few dogs. She has 4 grandkids now. Ray Scott. Ray is a consultant and senior partner at Experience on Demand. He specializes in supply chain management. He has decades of experience in supply chain management, and he's also an expert at karaoke and even won a karaoke contest. So that's pretty fun. Next up, we have Mark Baxa. He's the founder, president, and CEO of Fernia Creek LLC. Mark is a leading expert in supply chain consulting. He's traveled the world and worked in 40 countries on supply chain management. Mark has also ridden in several presidential motorcades, which is amazing to me that I actually know somebody who's ridden in a presidential motorcade. He's crazy about fishing up north, and he's also obsessed with Christmas decorations. He says his wife calls him Marka Stewart. So I think he's pretty excited. Maybe he's even got some decorations up. I'm not sure. We have to ask. So let's go ahead and get started. So we have 2 Marks today on the panel. I'm going to start with Mark Bowers. So Mark, just to get you started, just to get the group started here before we start answering questions in chat, what are some of the day-to-day stories that you're hearing from manufacturers that you know? Like, what are some of the struggles, and like, are they having issues getting certain supplies? A little overview.
Yeah, so some of the field stories that we're hearing are people who tried to preemptively move their production or their reliance out of China and into other countries, only to find out that there was some subcomponent of what they needed that was still China dependent, and it didn't buy them anything in terms of timelines. And I think the importance of that story to me is that in middle market firms, privately controlled firms that are up to $100 million in net revenue, say, for example, you don't always have the resources of a large multi-billion-dollar corporation to track things back through to practically the raw materials. So no matter how you plan, no matter how well-resourced you appear to be, you're going to be beholden to some of these uncertainties, number one. Number two, I think the other thing that brings home is it brings home a definite sense of the complexity that's involved in manufacturing pretty much anything. When you take relatively inane products that we take for granted, consumer products that you might buy at Target or at Walmart, and then you try and actually track all of the components back through the supply chain, and you realize that even when academicians have tried this, it's not as easy as just figuring out where things come from. And when stops and slowdowns at any point in that supply chain can slow down the production of a finished product, and when those products that we're talking about now are as simple as things like toasters, imagine what that complexity looks like when you manufacture more complicated products, or imagine what those slowdowns could look like when you manufacture more complicated products. So in summary, I think that what I'm hearing, or what I am hearing, is I'm hearing a lot of independently owned, operated, and controlled facilities where there are just a lot of unknowns that previously were felt to be known, or at least controlled enough that they weren't risks. And now people are realizing that every single component of whatever it is their finished product is, has some supply chain risk associated with it. So, I guess in summary, that's the perspective. Those are the stories that I'm hearing from owners in the field. Marianne, you're muted.
Marianne, you're muted.
Oh, no, I muted myself. I'm sorry. Okay. I was going to go over to Mark and Ray next to see what they thought about this. And also, can they tell me why we're still not able to find Clorox wipes? That just drives me crazy.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. So I think you can. It's a matter of timing, right? So the dependency around certain things like the necessities of home, which Clorox wipes is a classic example that people are using for preventative maintenance and care, is certainly something that will remain in very strong demand, and probably at record-breaking demand, just as it has been from the onset of the pandemic, when people learn this is just one of the necessary items. And there's many others that you can put on that list, including the infamous toilet paper case. Some of the challenges underneath this is a shift in supply chain. So if you think about years ago, and some of it's true today, you had refrigerators coming down the line, and at the very end, the ones that went left got this label, and the ones that went right got this label. Well, if you think about it in terms of the industrial supply chain versus the domestic supply chain for like items, it's difficult to make shifts from if you will, that supply pipeline has historically been manufactured for the consumer versus industrial. And although it may be some of the same formulations of product, they don't look the same. And shifting those supply chains to react to demand that has, quintessentially changed so dramatically overnight doesn't necessarily happen overnight. So we're learning a lot about preparedness and responsiveness. And I think the lessons today are going to be the roadmap for tomorrow. But that shift, we can talk about how things need to be different. The mechanical, physical, and talent shift and training required to make these shifts doesn't happen just with the snap of the finger. However, just saying all of that, there is some examples where companies have responded very quickly because they had the innate ability to do that, and the, if you will, the structure that allowed that to happen. And I think the key point here, and I'm looking across at one of our questions, the key point is there's other, if you will, factors ahead of the pandemic that was already in a state of creating, if you will, disruption in our supply chain, such as the geopolitical trade shift that was happening at a high rate of speed. And again, the ability to adapt is also kind of in precedence here. It set the precedence of the challenges the supply chain was already facing, and then COVID, which layered in the human element, and then you back into that, the shift in demand. We've got quite a complex cycle of dynamics that are impacting our ability to respond. We are responding, but our pace of response is perhaps not equal to the rapid and shifting pace of response on the consumer and business side.
Great, thank you, Mark. Ray, do you want to add anything to that?
Good morning, everyone. I think the main thing that I'm seeing coming out of this is that the supply chain is much more complex than people gave it credit for, as Mark said. I think the other thing that we're seeing is that there's been a lot of emphasis over the past 5 to 10 years on lean just-in-time deliveries, small package sizes, things like that. All of that's great when you have steady demand. And I think to go back to the question about Clorox wipes, Mark addressed that very well. The big change, of course, is in the demand profile. The number of us that did not have Clorox wipes in our home and suddenly were looking for them certainly expanded. So I think the ability to respond quickly is not as simple as Mark said. It's not as simple as it seems, but basically I think people are still adapting. We still don't know what the future is going to hold. And the other thing that I see is it's merely accelerated a lot of changes that we saw on the way, such as working from home, deliveries to home instead of going to the grocery store, things like that. So our whole mode of acquiring things as a consumer has changed, and that resonates all the way up through the supply chain line.
Thanks, Ray. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say the question in the chat, and this is indirectly related to what Mark and Ray just mentioned. But when you're talking about nearshoring, offshoring, and reshoring, there's so many nuances to that decision making. You can't just say, well, I'm going to leave China and I'm going to do everything in the United States. Well, there may not be everything in the United States for you to make that shift. So you have to be very strategic about that. There are some things that may remain in China for the duration because that's the best place for it to be. But to that end, I wanted to bring up, for example, when you're talking about nearshoring, reshoring, and offshoring, there are resources that people can look at, whether they're a small to mid-sized company or a giant company like Emerson or Worldwide. For example, the Reshoring Institute, headed by Rosemary Coates, it's out in California, but she was just with us last week, a panel discussion talking about that very thing, that it's not bringing your suppliers, your partners, and your vendors are working with folks just in the US. Maybe you're in Mexico, maybe you're in Canada, maybe you're looking at a North America change in your supply chain as opposed to a European, and so on. So there's a lot of opportunity to make a shift. As Mark Boxa said, it's not going to happen overnight, but there's a lot of resources that companies, large and small, can look to. So this is oddly a self-serving plug for our centers. But whether it's at UMSL, whether it's at SLU, whether it's at WashU, Rankin, and so on, even here in St. Louis, there are so many opportunities for resources, mini consulting, for just help in general surrounding supply chain, surrounding procurement, surrounding operations, logistics, and so on, to reach out. Even on this panel, you know, Mark and Ray and I, we all have day jobs, but Ray represents Apex, and I guess it's ASM now. Mark Boxa represents CSCMP and a few others. And, you know, with Mark Bowers and St. Louis Makes and all these other things, there are so many resources for companies big and small to say, hey, I need help, and we can help. So I would make a plug for people to look around, because we are uniquely situated here in the Midwest. With a lot of ways people can get supply chain help very reasonably and very accurately.
Thank you, Cindy. Thanks, guys. So I had a comment from the chat. I need to read the question because a couple of people are saying we're not able to see the questions coming in. So can you read the question out loud? Sure. So here's the first chat question. To what degree does I'm sorry, typo. To what degree does it make sense to use local suppliers within the US versus overseas suppliers during the pandemic? Can you be more specific about the pros and cons? So I think Cindy kind of touched on that, but Mark and Ray, could you also weigh in?
I can take a comment on that, Mary Ann. I think as far as the pros are definitely response time. If you've got local suppliers or domestic suppliers, you're able to respond quickly. There's a couple of cons. One is that the cost is usually going to be higher. That's probably the biggest thing. And as Cindy said, I think it's important to note that a number of the supplies that you need, such as electronics, may not be available directly from US suppliers. You may be going through distributors that are still sourcing from overseas or other locations. So even though you have a local source, their source is located overseas. the thing I would encourage people to see is a hybrid type of sourcing strategy where you source a certain percentage from a less expensive overseas source, but on a regular basis, also buying from a domestic source, keeping them in business, and your quality requirements. And over time, you kind of cost average a little bit higher than what you had, but you're able to source more reliably from your domestic suppliers.
Absolutely. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I was just going to say that those are great perspectives that Ray shared. And the kind of another way to say it is, it depends. It depends on the industry vertical that you're in and where the critical mass of manufacturing and technology exists. You know, over time, the reality is we have helped certain countries such as China in aggregate grow in so much capacity to deliver, if you will, higher and higher quality each and every time we go after certain technologies. Same thing with South Korea, with Malaysia, with the United States, Canada, Mexico. There's such a diversification of real supply chain capability and manufacturing excellence that exists, and we have centers of excellence in supply chain that now exist in certain countries. So the idea of nearshoring certainly or onshoring makes a lot of sense if you've been sourcing internationally and you've learned that through the pandemic that those 5,000 miles can no longer be tolerated for a number of reasons, and you're building a different responsiveness or network out. That's fine, but the ability to adapt and do that on a reliable basis, because you may have to bring some of that back to the US or to any country. So you have to look at where that critical mass and the intelligence and the capability exists, because what you're after is to build reliability and flexibility and adaptability into your supply chain. And just because it may be offshore doesn't mean that it's a something to be feared from a reliability perspective. So it really depends. It requires some very thoughtful and, if you will, kind of forensics on the sourcing side to understand where your best relationships for reliability and quality can occur over time.
And maybe build on what Mark and Ray had said, I think that a lot of times when you look at supply chain and you think about the product and everything that goes into getting all the raw materials and getting the components and everything else, you know, adjacent to that is whether or not you actually have the intellectual capital or the experience and the skill set to pull all of that together. And I guess the example that I think of is, you know, especially in workwear, in footwear, shoes, you know, obviously there's a big Made in America push, and that means something to the trades, and it means something to people that wear those products. And I've had people that are deep in that industry say, look, they said, I don't care how much people claim in the footwear space to be made in America. They said that entire industry is such that we could not do that 100% ourselves any longer if we had to, just because we don't have the skill sets to pull all of the components together. So there's cost, to be certain, and that's maybe the reason why a lot of that left the country in the first place. But then there's also the reality of where that intellectual capital and where that tribal knowledge, that experience resides. And if that experience no longer resides in your country, then that's a massive, massive retraining commitment to try and bring that back as an industry. You know, and some of those efforts are just not realistic. You know, the point I think of our other panelists as well, you know, might be better served with hybrid models or with other approaches. There's more to it than just the parts, I guess is what I'm saying. The knowledge base is very important that you use to pull all those parts together and add value and create something in the first place.
That makes sense. Thank you, guys. This is great insights here. Here's another question from the chat. What measures can companies take to protect their supply chain operations? So I guess, is there anything that we can do, anything companies can do? Maybe Ray, do you want to start?
Yeah, we do. As far as protecting your supply chain, I think the biggest thing is just investigate your supply chain partners. For example, you may be buying from a supplier in China and you don't realize that they're actually subcontracting 2 or 3 levels down until something goes wrong. So I think it's incumbent upon you to map out the supply chain all the way down to where things actually come from. That's probably the biggest thing. The other key, and I'll turn this over to Mark here in a minute, one of the Marks, but the other key thing I think is open communications with your supply chain. Share information with them, get into a situation where you can call them and know that they're going to give you straight answers. And that implies, of course, that you're going to have to do some travel. You're going to have to meet with people face to face as much as possible. A little tough right now, right? It's a little tough, but that should be a goal of yours at some point, to actually physically visit your suppliers and understand when they're telling you the truth and when they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good insight.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Sorry to jump on top there. The whole idea is risk analysis today is going to become a bigger part of our supplier selection or reassurance of our current base of suppliers. And those that become most strategic are the ones that are going to participate at a level that Ray just outlined. They're going to be transparent about their supply chain and their relationships with their own suppliers in order to help you understand the reliability factor that they perhaps are saying that they actually can support what you need. You're going to have some proof, and those that unveil what that proof is so you can better understand and reflect on it and work collaboratively to ensure gaps are closed to the extent that you can are going to be very key, I believe, in the sourcing and procurement professionals toolkit. And we're going to have to learn how to do that. There are going to have to be models that are going to be developed independently, but also collaboratively. And when I say independently, that's unique for each business. Each vertical is different. Every industry is different. But when I say collaboratively, the risk-based approach certainly can be at a level that can be easily adopted. And we talk about risk management all the time, but pre-COVID, and even pre-geopolitical, highly disruptive to the supply chain. Both of those, if you will, are just giant events and impact areas that affected our supply chain. And we really saw we weren't evident, and we really weren't ready for it. So we had to really dig and figure out how we were going to climb out of it. So when we talked about risk, we were talking really about probably quality and financial stability. Now risk becomes assurance of supply, and we have to look at that in a much different way than we have before.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, and Mary Ann, to jump on that a little, down a different rabbit hole, if you will, there's also technological tools that folks can use to monitor, track, and traceability of their supply chain. For instance, blockchain. The folks at IBM are touting that, and there's a lot of opportunity there. But with utilizing technology as part of your toolkit for a successful supply chain, there can be disruptions in that as well, cybersecurity being one. And to kind of go back to my touting all the resources that we have here, there are some really incredibly intelligent folks that run CyberUp, which is part of the Midwest Cybersecurity group here in town, in the bi-state region, actually. That's Tony Bryan, Bob Elfenbaum, Jason Carter. These gentlemen are on the mark, but again, there's a resource for any of these questions. All you have to do is just ask someone, whether it's you, Mary Ann, you, Mark, myself, but there are folks and people who are ready to help in all of these ways. But I wouldn't discount the technology piece, especially as Ray mentioned. You source one thing, but they source it from another, especially distributors and smaller companies. They might kind of look away at the technology piece as too expensive, but there are opportunities that can be built just for them as well.
I was just going to throw a couple of things in. So at a macro level, more of a strategy level, I'd be really interested in seeing companies just do supply chain maps where instead of identifying the country or the source of supply, it was identified more around the frame of mind of how hostile that source could potentially become on short notice to the US. Because I think there's some risk there that we also have realized in the last year. Certainly to be certain there's just some risk there. So, obviously you want multiple sources of supply. Don't want to understand how friendly those sources are to you at a macro level to begin with, number one. And then number two, build on maybe something that I believe it was Ray or possibly Mark had said when we opened this session, and that was the leaning out of supply chain. If you got some critical components that you cannot live without, you might want to consider maybe unleaning those a little bit more than you have, because having a couple of hours of supply at any given time is really awesome. I jest when I say a couple of hours, but you know what I'm talking about. And that's great if you're making a presentation to a financial or a private equity group in New York City. It's far less great when you're trying to actually produce a product that needs to get out to a customer. And at that point, you gotta ask yourself, maybe sucking up a couple of nodes in that supply chain and going heavy on some components would have been a more prudent strategy. And I think that's something that needs to be revisited. I guess the third thing I'll throw in is for things that are strategically critical to the survival of the country and to the survival of human beings, there needs to be some sort of support and initiative. And I know there are, and I know that these initiatives are underway, but in those categories and in those verticals, that stuff we need to have domestic. We need to have an understanding of what we could do, to meet our own needs without having to be China dependent in any way, shape, or form. Personal opinion, but that's just my take.
Yeah, that's a good point there, Mark. We have another question. How concerned do I need to be about the ongoing U.S.-China trade war and its resultant tariff impacts during COVID? All right, who wants to talk about this?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that if you're okay with it. So let's talk just about the COVID pandemic. This was not an area where we saw a lot of relief coming forward at all in terms of financial relief for the economy, at least here in the U.S. So it's a direct signal that this is an area where compression is going to remain in the fore in terms of holding back any kind of rapid expansion in China from a business perspective by level setting the cost position of supplies for many products coming out of China versus what they can be produced for maybe domestically or perhaps in other places. The truth of the matter, I believe, in this whole negotiation with China is threefold. Certainly, the ability for U.S. industry to compete has been part of it. But I think the greater two areas and two aspects are, first and foremost, to accelerate the pace and speed of the conversations the U.S. wants to have with China, number one. And underneath that is the other component, which is the idea around security. And it's digital security, it's process security on a number of levels, and to some degree it's human security as well. So I think they're here to stay for the period of time that I would say over the next couple of years minimally. And regardless of what happens in November, I don't think even if there's a party shift in the White House, I don't believe that we're going to see any kind of rapid change occur. There may be some dialogue, but the shift is probably going to be gradual at best. So let's think about the strategies around tariffs and, if you will, what you can do about them in the short and the long term. So just like COVID is forcing us to look at our sourcing strategies, we should have been looking at this all along in terms of where can we play, where can we be successful if it's not here in the U.S. as a U.S.-based centric manufacturing company that needs components from other places, or a retail-ready company that imports the goods in finished form. If it's not China, where else can it be? And with that comes some challenges. Yes, we can move to Vietnam. Yes, we can move to South Korea. Yes, we can go to Mexico. The USMCA is very appealing for many different supply chains and for different reasons, but ultimately financial. But with all of that comes the challenge of infrastructure, the ability to compete based on other factors such as logistics, and can we enable speed in the supply chain. The talent piece that Mark and Ray referred to is a huge factor in all of this as well. And just the state of the industry in that vertical, is it mature? Is it maturing, or does it even exist to be able to shift certain industries or component manufacturing to other countries? And countries have also shown their willingness to take on business in lieu of the trade tariffs that have come into play with China. But there's other things in the making as well that countries have been challenged by here from a U.S. perspective that we need to consider from a business perspective. So think about the integrity that goes along with shifting to other countries. The U.S. is careful about these things, and all data around trade is very transparent. Like it or not, we can see what's going on in a number of different cases at all different levels, if you will. So we know when electronics moves from China rapidly to Vietnam, and all of a sudden things are immediately made in Vietnam and shifting to the U.S., that creates a very, if you will, eye-opening experience for regulators to look at and say, how are they getting this done? We're aware that there's limits in terms of what can be done in some of these countries, and how could it be within a matter of months, all of a sudden everything's made in Vietnam? Well, be very careful about your decisions and how you do these things and try to figure out solutions. So I would recommend that companies look at their product portfolio, take a look at what kind of design shifts can occur so that you can lessen impacts from a tariff perspective and still make them in China or still make them in other places. So there's a lot of different things to consider. But I don't believe that in the heart of hearts that the trade war, if you will, or the challenge of working with China from a tariff perspective is going to be erased anytime soon. So we're going to have to continue to look at alternative sourcing strategies and, if you will, designs of products that help work us away from the high tariff rates and the ad valorem of the Section 301 tariffs.
Thank you, Mark. I'm glad you provided some strategies too, like some takeaways for the people watching.
If I can I add a comment here, Mary Ann?
Yes, absolutely.
100%, very well done, Mark. I would point out to everybody that we're talking China, but there are other countries that we may be sourcing from. India comes to mind, very popular a few years back. They've had fairly dramatic political changes as well. And I think to Mark's point, wherever you're sourcing from, you need to do assessment and be looking for what's going on and what are the possibilities that you might run into, and to stay on top of that.
Thanks, Ray. We have another question in the chat. I feel like we were kind of touching on the same thing. It might be a little different. It says, is it a good idea for a company to period renew their supply chain even in a non-pandemic disaster time? Small businesses are generally the last to be contacted by one of their suppliers undergoing change, filing for bankruptcy, being acquired, major leadership, personnel change, including your main supplier contact. Ray, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, small businesses are always more at risk, frankly, than large businesses because they don't have the resources to do the sort of structured risk assessment and supply chain mapping that we're talking about. I was just thinking as we were talking through here, it might be a business opportunity for somebody to work with small businesses and take a number of them on as clients and do some sort of structured risk assessment for them. But you're always going to have to be in contact, large or small, with your suppliers and your supply chain, also your customers, to find out what's going on there. It's just a little bit harder for a small business because it does require an investment in time and expertise.
Those are good insights, Ray. And I think in terms of looking for adverse news or adverse media, that's always good to do a poll and take some time to reflect on your supply chain and your partners. There are software companies that, if this is what the question is really tied to, I'll kind of leap to this real quickly, that there are software providers that, if you will, coagulate all the kind of the publicly available data on companies and do some research for you and make adverse media analyses, or at least the raw data for you to analyze on your own. One of them is Global Radar. And I don't have any interest in these companies. I do use them in my consulting practice, but Global Radar is one. And another one that's really extensive and I think is pretty cool, and there's others like them, that allow you to take data from CDC, from news outlets, and all kinds of other data, Dun and Bradstreet, and to the extent that you want to fold it in to come up with a comprehensive risk assessment called risk methods. And like I say, there's other providers out there that do this, so you don't have to do one-off searches. Now, if your supply chain is fairly concise in terms of your sourcing strategy, and you have a limited portfolio, or manageable portfolio, I should say, of suppliers, you can do your own homework pretty easily with a Google search periodically and look for adverse news around your suppliers that help you understand if if in fact there's risk in your supply chain. The other thing I think this question brings up is the factor of human rights. Now, if you're a company that's importing into the United States, and I don't mean to be so US centric here, but this is an example. Same thing for Europe, Japan, Australia, they all have the same rules, pretty similar. But perhaps the one that uses more of its extraterritorial legal reach is the United States. So we're looking upon companies that are either using US-owned technology, buying technologies from other places very carefully. And regulators are very interested that we're doing the right things as companies, that we're screening for these things. But human rights is a subject I want to bring up real quickly. So in terms of risk, assessing your supply chain and even your own business, there are rules and there's laws on the books now, like as recent as August of 2017, that prohibit us from having North Korean labor anywhere in our supply chain. And that includes your suppliers' suppliers. So doing those kinds of assessments, because it's always been the fact that you really cannot use bonded enslaved labor in your supply chain, or have suppliers that use that labor when importing goods into the United States. So these laws are changing quite a bit. So if you're thinking about adverse media, things that could potentially come back and reflect negatively on your business, that your suppliers may actually cast upon you by their own bad behaviors, if you will, or incorrect behaviors, it is a good idea to search the media and use tools to come up with these kind of answers that will help you assess and challenge your suppliers to make sure that they're operating with the level of integrity that you expect. So I think that's a very good idea. And it has nothing to do with the size of your business. I have clients tell me, well, we're a small company. I didn't realize these rules applied to me. Well, hello, they do, right? So the reality is this is something that's good for all companies to do.
Thank you, Mark.
I just wanted to quickly add an oversimplified response, I think, to that question, or and that is for a smaller company, the simple fact that you're doing something is better than doing nothing. So if you think about it at the core, like the oversimplified reality is, you could set up Google alerts around the names of suppliers. I mean, that's better than doing nothing. And it's not complex. It doesn't involve software. It doesn't involve a lot of these other things that are maybe better resourced and sized and scaled to larger corporations. It might not give you control, but it gives you a step in the right direction. And it certainly gives you more insight than you had prior to setting something as basic as that out. So, I think that it's incumbent on smaller companies to come up with workarounds, and even something that simple at least gets your frame of mind where it needs to be to start to address and hopefully ultimately mitigate that risk somewhat.
Thank you, Mark. We have another question here in the chat. How much should rising cost of labor, logistics in China be considered in our 2021 supply chain planning?
I'll go first on this one, and I'll just talk to the last little bit, and I'll let the experts kind of weigh in on the bigger questions there. But again, in talking with Rosemary last week, we were planning for our panel discussion. We were talking about that very thing, intellectual property and so on in China. And I mean, it sounds very simplistic, but know your audience. That yes, if you are in China or you plan on going to China, when you try to leave, it will be difficult, and they're not just going to forget what you made, what you manufactured, and they're not going to forget your product design, your technology, and what you did to create whatever it is you created, whatever they supplied, whatever they helped manufacture, and so on. So it really is, again, it sounds simplistic, but know your audience. And if you go to a country that's promising really great rates at labor costs and really big margins, be aware, take a look at why that is, because to Mark's point, there could be human rights abuses, there could be all kinds of things, but it truly is, if it's too good to be true, it's probably not that good. So really take a look at that. And it's not to be China bashing here at all, but anywhere you go where you're bringing new design, new technology, new product, as Mark has said, both Marks and Ray, over and over again, have conversations, travel there, go there if you can, but know exactly what you're getting into, whom you're going to work with, and who they work with up and down your supply chain for vendors, for partners, and suppliers. But with China, I would have to agree. You need to be very careful about what you plan to do. Do we want to just say no China all the time? Absolutely not. But it is up to you as the company, big or small, to do your homework first.
Thank you, Cindy.
Yeah, just to jump in here real quick, I appreciate everything you said, Cindy. This just goes along with really excellence in your sourcing strategy. Yes, of course, anywhere you go, as soon as it gets outside of the four walls of your company, there's a risk of intellectual property escape or loss. And you harden that down by contractual relationships, non-disclosure agreements, and do your due diligence on partners that have a really outstanding reputation for preservation of your interests. And you want to align with companies like that. Those companies exist in China, they exist in India, Vietnam, and other places. I mean, there are people that really understand that their business is based on integrity. So that's key. And that really gets to benchmarking those companies and looking at external research partners to help you understand, are they who they really are, and can they sustain for you the level of protection that you need? And are they least likely? Are they the least likely or the lowest risk, if you will, in that industry vertical? So again, there are ways to research that, and you need to take your time and do the right due diligence from an IP perspective. In terms of labor and logistics cost and just total cost of supply chain, that gets back to simply modeling the reliability as well as the total cost of ownership factors to deliver the kind of quality and the volume and the timing that you want it. So that goes without saying that, irrespective of the geopolitical challenges that we're seeing, not just with some in Europe, and depending on what industry you're in, obviously, if you're in the aeronautics business, Europe is a big deal right now. So it gets back to stick with your capability and your assessment to model your total landed cost, your total cost of ownership, I should say, and then also factor in the layers of protection that are needed around IP and use external research firms to help you assess, to validate your IP, in fact, could be protected at the level you'd like it to be protected. I think those are key things to consider.
Thank you, Mark. Let's see, we've got another question here. How do manufacturers manage labor resource uncertainty during the crisis? Okay.
I'd like to take that, Mary Ann. Labor uncertainty is often labor availability. I think maybe what we're looking for here. It's difficult. You may need to subcontract to somebody that has a better labor supply. You may need to find some way to compensate people, not just wages and benefits, but working conditions. I think we all like to work in a pleasant environment. We all like to be valued. And you find that word about good places to work get around. So you might want to step back and take a look about the work environment that you're in. It's a very difficult time with COVID-19, obviously. You have people that are afraid to show up to work. You have people that show up to work and get sick, and now you've got a problem. I think you should be looking at alternate sources of labor. I know many years ago we had a plant in the Boston area, and for their third shift, they were able to find off-duty firemen to come in and do some work for them. So you may need to open up and find some things like that. You may need to look at automation as another way to do that, or work simplification so that you can do more with the same amount of labor. All of those are things that I think you should consider. But taking a step back and kind of reinventing where you are is probably a good idea. What have we not thought about doing that we could do and require less labor or a different type of labor.
I like that. That's good. Great ideas. We're probably going to, let's move on to another question because we've got about 15 minutes. We have a couple more here. Managing absenteeism, safe working environments, technology automation, employee screening protocols, workforce labor planning, etc. What investments, oh, I'm sorry, I think both of these questions are stuck together. I'm not sure what I'm asking here. What investment, or let me see, what investments can we make in inventory while simultaneously working to preserve cash flow? Let's go with that one because there's not really a good question surrounding the first thought. Mark Baxa, do you want to take that? Or Ray? Ray, go ahead. You unmuted yourself.
Yeah, no, I unmuted myself because I feel like I'm the inventory guy on the panel, although Mark can do
no,
it
this is
too.
perfect. Perfect.
I think the thing we're going to see coming out of COVID-19 that's pretty obvious, and Mark Bowers mentioned this earlier, people are going to be looking at that dreaded word safety stock. They're going to be looking at backup supplies. They're going to have to invest, I think, more in inventory, whether it's at their supplier or actually on their location, in order to make sure that they can supply their customers. Because if you can't supply your customers, you're not going to be in business very long. And I think what COVID-19 has exposed is how thin and fragile our supply chains have been. I was reading an article yesterday and we talked about black swan occurrences, so things that you couldn't see coming. They brought up the concept of black elephants. Well, black elephant is something that you should see, but you don't want to admit it's out there. And maybe our pandemic here falls into that, because you can go back and find Bill Gates 5 years ago talking about exactly the situation that we're in today. It wasn't completely unforeseen. Cybersecurity is another area where we might run into black elephants that we may or may not want to deal with. But I think if you want to continue to service your customers, it's probably incumbent to invest more in inventory. That may mean also investing in storage locations as well. So a little bit more capital investment. And certainly we've talked already about shortening your supply chain or your time to replenish, and that would help your ability to do that. So if you can combine all of those things, a little bit here, a little bit there, I think it's probably going to be the best way to manage your cash flow.
Oh, I like that. That's good.
I would throw on top of what Ray said, I would say that under normal circumstances, when you got the private equity guys breathing down your neck and you're trying to cut corners and cut costs incredibly so, there's two things. You have a very, very, very narrow window of opportunity, I feel, right now to take advantage of. That is, number one, as much as private equity guys feel that they and they alone are outside of the bounds of human psychology, the reality is that they still swim like a school of fish. And right now there's a lot of awareness around what Ray just mentioned. So you, in theory, should have a lot more patience and a lot more interest in taking a look at alternatives that were unacceptable financially very, very recently. So I think that's a window of opportunity that, until that changes, you've got a narrow window in which to prove that point and in which to make change in the industry, or at least in the company. I think another thing that is going to come of all of this is you've got and this isn't a narrow window, but this I think will accelerate. You've got an opportunity to look at maybe more efficient of robots or cobots as an alternative to some of the human challenges that we've identified. People are trying to take variability out of the system. People are trying to take risk out of the system. That's one way to do that and still address cost issues. So you got a couple of things, but you need to look at what the psychology of the impact is and who the listening audience is. I mean, if you're privately controlled and you own it and you're willing to just go deep, implement the systems and be best in class and have that flexibility. If you've got to deal with a private equity overlord, you've got a very narrow window of opportunity to maybe make a case to what otherwise would not have probably been very compassionate ears to listen to any changes you were interested in looking at.
Thanks, Mark. Mark Baxa, you want to go ahead?
Just to layer in that here, I think the most important thing companies can do is look at their greatest opportunity for success and sustainability of that success in the next period of time. And that could be 3, 6, 12 months, and align the inventory strategy and the dynamics of demand as best you can. And they're never 100%, but as Mark said, and Ray alluded to clearly, that right now is the time for a shift in strategy to build in reliability in the supply chain. The consumers and business consumers, if you will, of the products that you make that they need, do not like the fact that, example, Marianne, the Clorox wipes can't be found on the shelf when I want to find them. So you got to find that sweet spot, and it might be that risk and inventory, smart risk and inventory, is where we are for a short period of time, with the idea that you'll have to shift as the demand shifts as well. So that's where that whole piece around supply chain agility comes in that we've been talking about throughout this conversation. But I believe the idea around leaning out the supply chain, zeroing out inventory balances and those kind of things, and make to order is probably not the smartest way to go for many of us in the supply chain today. We have to have some safety stock, but that has to be carefully planned.
And if I could jump into what Mark is saying too, when you're looking out to create these safety stocks and these nimble supply chains, don't forget about distribution and transportation, whether it's from your company side or your consumer side. For example, on the consumer side, Amazon has mentioned the new Black Friday is going to be October 10, and this has everything to do with being able to distribute and transport orders that might come in. And they're not alone. Walmart, Target, Home Depot, they're all looking at pushing these things up because of transportation difficulties that they're trying to overcome ahead of time. So from a consumer standpoint, do your Christmas shopping now, order your butter now, get these things in the freezer because it's going to get tight. But you always have to pay attention to what the consumer side is, even if you're on the company side of things, because transportation and distribution, they're commingled. So it's not like there's just a truck for butter that you used to bake in your home. Butter goes to restaurants, butter goes to schools, butter goes all over the place. So you have to remember that consumer demand, consumer shopping data and things like that impact your company as well. So don't forget about the transportation folks either.
That's true.
Just cover it's just get your money sooner.
I think on some of the stuff that Cindy said, that cannot be stressed enough. I find so many parallels a lot of times when I look at supply chain and I look at physics. Think about engineering. A civil engineer designs a dam, and the water fills up behind it slowly. That's an entirely different math equation than releasing all of that water or most of that water at once and heading it straight to that dam. That's two totally different math equations. And you think one of those is far more desirable than the other. And when you think about the shock that hits in supply chain around Christmas or around seasonal products or around any other exogenous event that causes stress like that, the math is no different. I mean, that's not desirable. It takes a lot of things out with it, just like a flow of water.
That's true. These are all great ideas. I'm going to make my list now. I got to get my supplies. I was just thinking how we ran out a while back too. I couldn't find yeast to Clorox wipes. I got to get that in for Thanksgiving. Besides this, I got another question. We have, what can you tell me about India as an alternative supply resource? And are there any up and coming countries we should be paying attention to that are growing in reputation as a good supply source? What do you guys think? Any new country up and comers? Mark Baxa, you travel everywhere. What do you think?
Well, let's talk about India. It's a great question. India is a country with great capacity to do a lot of things. The question is, what you want to source from India may not be the industry that India is centric in, or that particular industry vertical has not been built out to the extent that you might need it to be a reliable supplier. Can it be done? Yes, the willingness is there, the smarts are there just like they are anywhere else. The challenge with India is to understand the climatic conditions that can impact the actual logistics and quality of your product. And here's a case in point. A client that shifted part of its production to India, and all things were systems go. Everything was fantastic. Alignment of quality, the volume, the resources, the manufacturing capacity overall. And one area that was overlooked was how the containers get loaded. And wouldn't you know, during the monsoon season in these particular manufacturing regions, inventory got wet. And by the time that inventory arrived to its destination, it was moldy. So the challenge is that although we might have capacity, we have to look at some of the peripherals as well. So do your homework, do it very carefully. Look at the kinds of things that preserve the quality and integrity after you determine the manufacturing capacity is there. Be sure to look at those areas. And then finally, I would look at infrastructure, depending on what port you're coming out of, or if you're flying it, that's another scenario to look at. What do the logistics pieces look like that Cindy talked about? And is the capacity there, but also is the quality? And finally, I would say security. You know, India can be a great place to do a lot of things. Set your standards and make sure that they can comply with what you need to preserve the security of your supply chain as well. I'm not saying it's an area of vulnerability. I'm just saying that make sure something that if you are a US-centric importer or work for companies that do, or fund or finance companies that do, make sure that they have their supply chain buttoned down from a security perspective, no matter where they are. This is becoming an increasingly important piece with US Customs, whether they're part of the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism program, commonly referred to as CTPAT or not. Those are the elements you also need to look at. But certainly India is a country worth looking at, worth investing in, but you need to do your homework depending on the industry vertical you're in.
What about new up and coming countries? Is there anything?
Yeah, so yeah, I omitted that. I'm sorry. Glad you brought that up. Yeah, so let's take a really good look at what the former NAFTA, now USMCA, can do for you if you think about Mexico and Canada as alternative source countries. Certainly lower cost manufacturing capabilities exist in Mexico. You have to make sure that your total landed cost by the time you get it to where you want it to be is achieving your financial objectives. And like I talked about for India, that the manufacturing or supply chain capacity and the talent pool that Mark talked about, all the key factors that need to go into making sure you can deliver on your promises to your customers and your stockholders. But Mexico is definitely an area to continue to explore, and that window of opportunity from a cost position is in a very favorable state with USMCA, if you will, the free trade capability. So non-binding and tariff-free trade at this point. So I'd consider that. I'd look at other countries. Again, it depends on the industry vertical that you're in. You can just about look at any other place. You could look at Cambodia. You could look at Indonesia. You could look at Taiwan. You could look at South Korea, Philippines. There's a lot of capacity in other countries. At the same time, look right here in the United States. Building out infrastructure and reliability, shortening the window of your supply chain in terms of length of delivery, bringing things in from a near sourcing perspective is a key critical part of looking at total cost of operations and total cost to quality. So you may have the right strategy look right here at home as well. There's no reason why we shouldn't be. So I think it's multifaceted.
Thank you, Mark. It looks like we're right at time, but we might hang in here for like 2 minutes if everybody can. Do we have any closing thoughts? Or Ray or Mark Bowers, Cindy, do you want to add anything before I close?
I just want to say thanks to the other panelists because I think they covered of time, and I hope that was very helpful to everybody.
That's what I was going to say. It's just thank you for having us. It was a pleasure sitting among the experts of experts here on this panel. But I did want to remind the audience that all of this expertise is right here in your hometown. It's right here in St. Louis. So if you ever have any questions, for example, if you do reach out to me in our center, I'm not going to have the answer, but I work with Ray, I work with Mark, I work with all of these folks who have so much to offer and share. So don't hesitate. St. Louis, in our bi-state region, we have so much to offer in regard to supply chain support in all of those facets. Take advantage. You're very lucky to be here and have that. And thanks for having us.
I just wanted to quickly say thank you to the panelists, as well as to the production team behind the scenes, Marianne, Jake, and everybody else that's helped to pull this together. Certainly our supporters, Schmersel, as well as Enterprise Bank and Trust, and really, really appreciate the fact that you guys are on board, and look forward to continuing to work with you guys. Very much for helping us today.
Thank you all. Yes, on behalf of everybody at Schmersel Trevor, Enterprise Bank, St. Louis Makes, and Spoke Marketing, thank you. It's been an honor to be your moderator today. And we will be back here next Tuesday on how to, it's with the customer buying journey, how to get more revenue, the customer buying journey, and the map. We'll see you next Tuesday, and look us all up on LinkedIn, and we will see you later. Have a good day. Thank you.